Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, June 7th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Biden celebrates the death of Russian soldiers. So President Biden celebrated the deaths of Russian soldiers in Ukraine during a speech in Normandy, France, commemorating the 80th anniversary of D-Day. Biden said in his speech, quote, "They've suffered tremendous losses, Russia. The numbers are staggering. 350,000 Russian troops dead or wounded. Nearly 1 million people have left Russia because they can no longer see a future in Russia," end quote. And I mean, the symbolism here, this is D-Day. This is an event commemorating the 80th anniversary of a major battle of World War II. And here is the president, bragging about how many Russians he's killed in this proxy war. Now, we don't really know how many Russians have been killed or wounded. Both sides have not been putting out casualty numbers. It's likely that Ukraine has suffered more casualties since it's been mostly an artillery war. And in some cases, Ukraine has been outgunned completely. And in some cases, in some battles, they've been outgunned 10-1. So Russia's firing 10 times as much artillery as Ukraine. But anyway, I mean, just again, the symbolism here. And the fact that Russian officials were not invited to the D-Day commemoration despite the Soviet Union being an ally of the U.S. and France during World War II and suffering tens of millions of deaths. Something like, 27 million Soviet soldiers and civilians died during World War II. Biden used the event to rally support for NATO's proxy war in Ukraine, and he slammed the Russian President Vladimir Putin as a tyrant. Biden said, quote, "We know the dark forces that these heroes fought against 80 years ago. They never fade. Here in Europe, we see one stark example. Ukraine has been invaded by a tyrant bent on domination," end quote. So Biden also declared that NATO was the greatest military alliance in the history of the world, and he framed this proxy war in Ukraine as a battle for democracy, even though, Zelensky canceled elections and he's remained in power after his term ended. And it seems like many people in Ukraine are sick and tired of this war, but they didn't get a choice, whether to vote to continue it or not. So Biden, this is just, a very dramatic speech he gives trying to draw all these parallels between World War II and the war in Ukraine. He said, quote, "Let us be the generation that when history is written about our time in 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now, it will be said, when the moment came, we met the moment. We stood strong. Our alliances were made stronger, and we saved democracy in our time as well," end quote. So, again, this symbolism. He gave this speech about a week after signing off on Ukraine striking Russia with American weapons. Striking, so the U.S. is now actively supporting missile strikes inside Russian territory. I mean, huge escalation. And another very big escalation could come on Friday. According to a recent report from Reuters, Macron is going to hold a meeting with Zelensky, and Zelensky was invited to attend the D-Day commemoration. I wonder if any of the Azov battalion guys were invited. But anyway, so Friday, Macron is supposed to meet with Zelensky, and Reuters reported that after this meeting, France could announce that it is deploying troops to Ukraine to train Ukrainian soldiers. The report said that the plan is to send a few hundred trainers, and Russia has said they would be legitimate targets for the Russian military. So these things keep escalating, and they're getting set up for the next world war here, and this world war will be fought with nuclear weapons. It's not just going to be one country that has a nuclear weapon this time. So just, again, there's been so much concerning stuff with Ukraine, and just to see this speech, I mean, it's just completely despicable stuff. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. test fires 2 unarmed Minuteman, 3 nuclear ICBMs. So this week, the U.S. test fired their Minutemen 3 intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are designed to carry nuclear warheads and are part of the nuclear triad. So this test, of course, comes amid soaring tensions between the U.S. and Russia over the proxy war in Ukraine. The Air Force, in its press release on these tests, insisted that they had nothing to do with current world events. But the U.S. knows how this looks. There's actually been times where they canceled ICBM tests because of the tensions. But this time they decided to go through with it. So it does mean something. And the tests were conducted on June 4th and June 6th. The ICBMs were launched from a base in California, and both the Air Force and the Space Force were involved in the tests. And the missile's re-entry vehicles, which is the top part of the ICBM, that's where the nuclear warhead would be if they were launching a nuclear strike, it traveled about 4,200 miles to the Marshall Islands, to a U.S. missile test site in the Marshall Islands. In the U.S., there's a very dark history of U.S. nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, that the people there are still dealing with the effects of that. So it traveled 4,200 miles. I believe these missiles have a range of 6,000 miles, so very, very long range. And this launch comes a few weeks after Russia conducted drills simulating the use of strategic nuclear weapons, and Russia launched those drills directly in response to the provocative rhetoric from Western officials, specifically the talk about sending troops to Ukraine. All right, so the next one here, Israel dropped U.S. bombs on UN school in Gaza. So Israel used U.S.-provided bombs in strikes on a UN-run school in central Gaza that was sheltering thousands of displaced Palestinians, according to an analysis from CNN. So this was early Thursday morning, and it was a school in the Nuseirat refugee camp, again in central Gaza. And at least 40 Palestinians were killed, including 14 children and 9 women, according to Palestinian officials and hospital workers. According to the New Arab, they reported that some of the children who were killed arrived at the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in pieces. So really horrific, brutal stuff. And this school was sheltering thousands of displaced Palestinians. And Israel took credit for the attack. They claimed that it targeted Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad fighters, but they offered no evidence for the assertion. They just put out like a picture of the building, and they highlighted a spot in red and said, "See, there was fighters here," but I mean, it was just like not even a real picture of the building. It was like a graphic of the building. So they offered no evidence for that, and Palestinians who were sheltering at the school rejected the Israeli claims. So Ansam Issa, who's a Palestinian who lost her father and 2 brothers in the strikes, she told Middle East Eye, quote, "They're saying they were targeting fighters. What fighters? We don't have any weapons. We came here for safety with nothing but our tents and the clothes on our backs," end quote. She said her family sought shelter at the school just a day earlier after heavy Israeli bombing targeted the Burej refugee camp where they live. That's also in central Gaza. Israel has really ramped things up in central Gaza, these bombings. And according to CNN's analysis, Israel used at least 2 U.S.-made GBU-39 small-diameter bombs to hit the school. Debris of the U.S.-made bombs was spotted in a video recorded by a journalist working for CNN at the scene. So when asked if Israel used U.S.-provided weapons in the massacre, State Department spokesman Matt Miller said that was a question for the Israeli government. So they care so much about civilians being killed, but when Israel kills a bunch of civilians, they don't want to, they don't know anything about it. They get asked questions and they defer to the Israeli government. They refer the journalists to the Israeli government. It's a complete joke. So these bombs weigh 250 pounds. And these were the same ones used in the May 26th Israeli bombing of a tent camp for displaced Palestinians in western Rafah. That strike killed 45 Palestinians, including many women and children. So these massacres continue. And the U.S. Miller said that the attack on the UN school does not cross President Biden's red line. So, all this, it's just I mean, there's not, what else is there to say? There is no red line, obviously, but I think it's good how, because I mean, Israel's been using U.S. bombs for most of its bombing of Gaza, but I think it's good how now we're starting to see these analysis about, you know, what kind of bombs are used in specific strikes, especially now that there is more pressure on Biden, as there's all this dissent within the administration and everything, so that they could pull out and say, look, this is a U.S. made bomb that just bombed a school that was packed with civilians who were sheltering displaced people. All right, so the next one here, Gaza pier repairs will cost the U.S. military at least $22 million. So the Washington Post reported on Thursday that repairs to the U.S.-built pier that was damaged off the coast of Gaza will cost at least $22 million. And the U.S. military is currently working to repair the pier in the Israeli port of Ashdod, and the total cost of the damages could rise as high as $28 million. The pier broke apart due to heavy seas, as it was not capable of handling waves bigger than 1 or 2 feet. So they're going to put it back together and just put it back out there, and maybe it'll break apart again. So the Pentagon also said that the estimate of the overall cost has gone down. The initial estimate was $320 million, and that's a cost for building it and operating it for 3 months. Now the Pentagon is saying it might be more around $230 million, and they said that includes at least some of the repairs. So they lowered the whole estimate a little bit. And this new estimate, they said, is due to lower than expected expenses for contracted vehicles and drivers, and Britain's contribution of a military vessel to house the U.S. troops involved in the operation. So despite the disastrous start to this project, the Pentagon is looking to reconnect the pier to Gaza's shore later this week. And for the brief time that it was operating, barely any aid entered through this pier. I mean, and Israel's starvation blockade on Gaza has just been tightening and tightening since they captured the Rafah border crossing. And it's always worth pointing out that this pier idea, this was Netanyahu's idea initially. He was the one who first floated it to Cyprus back in October, so that, you know, I know a lot of people say there's probably nefarious purposes to this pier, which, you know, I think that's certainly possible considering it was Netanyahu's idea. And there was talk of him saying that it could potentially be used to deport, you know, remove Palestinians from Gaza, since Egypt's not letting them in. Hey, maybe we could ship them off. So I'm sure that's certainly something they're thinking about, if the pier can stay in one piece. All right, so the next one here, 9 out of 10 children in Gaza lack food for growth. This one's from Al Jazeera. About 90% of children in Gaza lack nutrition and face severe threats to their survival, growth, and development, according to the United Nations Children's Agency, UNICEF. A report published by UNICEF on Thursday laid bare the catastrophic impact of Israel's offensive on the enclave, which has caused the collapse of food and health systems, finding that 1 in 10 children survived on 2 or fewer food groups per day between December last year and April this year. Describing an appalling escalation in nutrition deprivation, the report also highlighted that 65% of children were fed diets with only 1 or no food groups in February, a 6-fold increase from the first half of December last year. And this is why we've seen at least dozens of children die, most of them with other health conditions, who need, you know, certain nutritional food and can't get it. And this is why women with, you know, newborn and infant babies can't make milk, and there's no formula, and it's just a complete nightmare for them. So just a horrific situation for the children and for their parents. All right, the next one here. Trump complains about Israel losing influence. So former President Donald Trump complained in an interview with Fox News' Sean Hannity about the Israel lobby not having as much influence over Congress as it once did, and vowed he would be a staunch supporter of Israel if reelected. Trump said, quote, "You know, Israel was the most powerful lobby in the country 15 years ago. today between Tlaib and AOC and all of these people, what they're doing, Israel, they don't have the backing that they once had, end quote. Hannity asked Trump if he would back Israel when he was elected, and the former president replied, quote, I'm good, but they don't have the backing, end quote. And then he went on to say that Senator Chuck Schumer, super pro-Israel, Trump went on to say that he is now like a Palestinian over his calls for elections in Israel. If you remember, Schumer came out and said there should be elections in Israel. Schumer is still 100% on board with supporting this genocidal war in Gaza. But this is what Trump said. I mean, it's just unbelievable. He said, quote, Schumer, he's become like a Palestinian. Chuck Schumer, Jewish, always strong for Israel. He's become like a Palestinian, end quote. So, I mean, it's just completely ridiculous. And Trump has made similar comments about Israel losing its influence on Congress. Unfortunately, it still has a very powerful lobby that has a lot of influence in Congress, and the vast majority of Congress is still going to vote to give Israel whatever it wants. But it did used to be stronger, that you didn't have people like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and AOC. But Trump made similar comments about Israel's influence in Congress in an interview with Israel Hayam back in March. He said, quote, some 15 years ago, Israel had the strongest lobby. If you were a politician, you couldn't say anything bad about Israel. That would be like the end of your political career, end quote. And, he's saying this like it's a bad thing, that they lost that control, that if you speak out against Israel now, it doesn't mean that it's the end of your political career. In the Hannity interview, the former president also claimed that there are people who deny that October 7th ever happened, that the Hamas attack ever happened. He said, quote, I have people now telling me they don't think the attack ever happened, end quote. I don't know what he's talking about there. Maybe he's talking about people who are pushed back against some of the atrocity propaganda, or talk about how the Israeli military killed some of the Israeli civilians, but he's saying that there are people who say it never even happened. So it's just, man, it's just out there. And then he was asked, basically what he would do in the current situation. And he repeated something he said in a few interviews, that Israel's got to finish the job. They got to go in there and finish it. Boom, boom, boom. Basically sounding like he's going to give Israel whatever it wants and kind of let them loose and, say, do whatever you got to do, which, could be very bad. So just kind of a ridiculous, some ridiculous comments there from the former president. Chuck Schumer, he's like a Palestinian. All right, so the next one here, inside the base where Israel has detained thousands of Gazans. So this is an article from the New York Times about the Israeli military base where they have been detaining thousands of Palestinians who were locked up, who they took from Gaza. Many of them tortured. They're blindfolded. They're left blindfolded. There's been pictures that come out of them, people just sitting around. It looks like Abu Ghraib a lot, just sitting around blindfolded. And there's accounts of torture. And this just gets into a lot of the details here. It's a very long report. There's really horrific accounts in here that the New York Times kind of buried in the story. But I think it is important to talk about. If you listen to this show with your kids or anything, I know we talk about some pretty gruesome stuff on here, but never details like this. Maybe skip ahead like 30 seconds or so. Because I just hit Control F and searched the word rectum to find what I want to talk about. So this is going to give you an idea of how gruesome this is. So Mr. Al-Hamlawi, the senior nurse, said a female officer had ordered two soldiers to lift him up and press his rectum against a metal stick that was fixed to the ground. Mr. Hamlawi said the stick penetrated his rectum for roughly 5 seconds, causing it to bleed and leaving him with unbearable pain. A leaked draft of the UNRWA report detailed an interview that gave a similar account. It cited a 41-year-old detainee who said that interrogators made me sit on something like a hot metal stick and it felt like fire, and also said that another detainee died after they put the electric stick the electric stick up his anus. So, and then he also recalled being forced to sit in a chair wired with electricity. He said that he was shocked so often after initially urinating uncontrollably. He then stopped urinating for several days. So torture, no other word for what they're doing here. Again, this is like the end of the article almost, where they put these accounts. So just really horrific stuff. All right. So the next one here, where are we? Hezbollah drone strike kills Israeli soldier and wounds 9. So this article is from Jason Ditz. As a result of a Hezbollah drone strike against Israeli troops in northern Israel, it is now reported that one of the soldiers, a reserve sergeant, Raphael Kodris, has died of his injuries. The strike took place in the Havar area of Upper Galilee. 9 other soldiers were reported wounded in the attack, which took place on Wednesday near the Israeli-Lebanon border. So Israel responded by carrying out heavy attacks against southern Lebanon, hitting buildings in towns and villages across the area. So no word here on casualties on the Lebanon side, but this situation continues to be very, very hot. And there's been all this talk lately about Israel really escalating this thing into like an invasion or something. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. sanctions Georgia over the foreign agents law. So on Thursday, the State Department announced sanctions on Georgian officials over a foreign agents bill that the Speaker of Georgia's parliament signed into law earlier this week. The law, titled On the Transparency of Foreign Influence, requires non-governmental organizations that receive at least 20% of their funding from abroad to register as foreign agents. The U.S. has been warning Georgia against enacting the law and threatened that there would be consequences. So according to the Associated Press, the sanctions impose travel bans on members of the ruling Georgian Dream Party, law enforcement officers, lawmakers, private citizens, and family members. When announcing the travel bans, Matt Miller, the State Department spokesman, he didn't name who was targeted, but he said that a few dozen people would be sanctioned, and he also threatened the U.S. would take more action if Georgia did not change course. So proponents of the bill in the Georgian Dream Party have compared it to the U.S. Foreign Agents Registration Act, known as FARA. That's a U.S. law that requires individuals or entities engaging in lobbying or other activity on behalf of a foreign country to register as foreign agents with the U.S. Department of Justice. Of course, the U.S. and opponents of the law in Georgia compare it to something that was enacted in Russia in 2012. They call it the Russian law. And that was part of Russia's response to the U.S. government funding NGOs and opposition parties. And the U.S. kind of voicing support for protesters. Hillary Clinton coming out in favor of protesters in Russia who were protesting the 2011 parliamentary elections. And all the claims about the election, I forget exactly what the claims were about the elections, but they came from U.S.-funded NGOs. And then you have Hillary Clinton, and that was a big turning point kind of for U.S.-Russia relations. But anyway, it's just something here. So the U.S. here is saying, Georgia's got to stop with this law, which is a reaction to, it's over concerns of foreign interference, why they passed this law. And then the U.S. response is foreign interference, is to sanction these officials over a law that they passed in their own country. And it was signed into law by the parliament speaker after it was vetoed by the president, but it was overridden by the parliament. And the White House has expressed support for the protesters inside Georgia as well. So something to keep an eye on, because the U.S. is probably going to keep increasing these sanctions, because that's all they know how to do, because I don't see Georgia reversing this law. All right, the next one here, U.S. bombers drop live bombs in threat to North Korea. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. 2 U.S. B-1 strategic bombers dropped live munitions on the Korean peninsula in a show of force eyeing Pyongyang. Tensions in the region have ratcheted up during the Biden administration, as the president has taken a very hardline approach in dealing with North Korea. The U.S. B-1Bs and 2 South Korean fighter jets dropped live GB-38 500-pound joint direct attack munitions on test targets in South Korea. So a press release from the Pentagon explained, quote, the B-1 carries the largest conventional payload of both guided and unguided weapons in the U.S. Air Force inventory and can rapidly deliver massive quantities of precision and non-precision weapons against any adversary anywhere in the world at any time, end quote. In addition to the live bombing, the U.S. and South Korean Air Forces conducted war games that involved U.S. Marine Corps F-35s, F-16s, and KC-135 Strato tankers and Korean F-35s and F-16s. So very provocative drills, just raising the tensions. And I believe this is the first time in a while that the U.S. has dropped live bombs on Korea for drills. And we've just seen this pattern over the past 2 years or so of the U.S. taking all these steps that they haven't done in a very long time, including sending nuclear weapons there, sending a nuclear-armed submarine, which Biden did last year. Just a provocation for the sake of a provocation. So tensions remain high on the Korean Peninsula. So that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints, one from Ramsey Baroud, Beyond Two-State Solution, Why Recognizing State of Palestine is Important. One from William J. Astore, Nuclear Armageddon is Us. One from William D. Hartung, Watchdog Calls for Eliminating Land-Based Nuclear Missiles. One from Ted Snyder and Nikolai and Petro, The West Should Be Receptive to Russia's Openness to Talks. And one from Theodore Postal, Droning Russia's Nuke Radars is the Dumbest Thing Ukraine Can Do. So please go check all of that out. This is it for the week for me. I hope everyone has a good weekend. Next week, there's going to be a full week of shows, but that will be the last week before my vacation. I'm going to be leaving next Friday, and I'm going to be gone for 2 weeks. So there's not going to be a show for 2 weeks. Antiwar.com is still going to be updated every day. Kyle will probably be doing a lot of writing for me, and you could watch his show, Conflicts of Interest. But yeah, so another week of shows, and then I'll be taking a little break. But you can support this show by sharing it, telling your friends, like, subscribe, all that stuff, comment. I appreciate everyone that does. I appreciate everyone that supports, listens to this show, watches it. I hope everybody has a good weekend. Thanks for listening.